Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Humans of AI podcast. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Daniel van Strien, machine learning librarian at Hugging Face. Daniel brings deep expertise from the GLAM sector and digital humanities into the AI and open source space. Daniel, thank you for joining us. Daniel, let's start with the spark. You have a background that spans digital humanities, academic libraries, and open science. And you've also worked with the British Library on the Living with Machines project. Could you tell us a bit about those early experiences that steered you towards the intersection of library science and machine learning? And perhaps just as importantly, how did the idea of democratizing machine learning for the GLAM sector first take shape for you?
Yeah, so I one of my lecturers when I was doing my library science master suggested it would be a good idea to learn to code, or at least kind of suggested this would be an area that could be useful for libraries in the future. So I kind of already was interested in how libraries could use technology quite early on. But when I was working on the Living Machines project, I was also taking this online course called FastAI Deep Learning for Coders, which is a course really about how to kind of practically use machine learning. And this was kind of pre LLM, so it was much more basic machine learning and deep learning. One of the first lessons in that course is about building an image classifier, which now is quite a kind of simple approach to machine learning. But at the time, I think I already had this realization that even something as simple as an image classifier could be incredibly useful for a lot of work that libraries do day to day. And actually, on that project, we used image classifiers for quite a few different things. So that included a project called MapReader, which was about working with large collections of digitized maps. And in the end, the actual kind of approach we were using was very simple in terms of training image classifiers to recognize different types of features on maps. There was also another project which was much more internal facing, about picking out digitized collection items that have been kind of mislabeled for kind of historic reasons. So I kind of had this realization at that point that there were lots of even fairly simple techniques for machine learning that could be very powerful for the GLAM sector. And I think the kind of realization was also that the tricky part is less about how you or the kind of techniques themselves, but how you actually apply them in a way that works within the kind of context of GLAM. So I think that's kind of been a theme that's kind of carried on even as the technology has changed. The kind of question I'm usually thinking about is, okay, how can this approach, which is often developed outside of the context of the GLAM sector and for very different use cases, how can those techniques and approaches be adapted to the needs of the GLAM community?
You've talked about the challenges of adapting tools that were originally designed for very different use cases, and how, in some cases, building your own might actually be the better path forward. Now, looking at the impact of AI, could you share a few examples of tools or datasets you've helped develop at Hugging Face that have particular relevance for the GLAM community? And which of these are you most proud of? And how do they make a tangible difference for the institutions or communities that use them?
Yeah, so I think there's a few um, areas that I'm kind of proud of, but I think probably the biggest one and probably a topic that I can kind of go on and on about is data sets. So I worked on this project called Big GLAM. So this came out of a kind of wider project that was led by Hugging Face. So this was before I worked at Hugging Face, but it was this kind of open science effort to train a very large language model, but to do it in the open. So to kind of work as a collaborative effort to develop the data sets and the model architecture and then train one of these large language models. And this Big GLAM effort was really focused on the kind of data set question, because I kind of observed that, there were lots of potential applications for machine learning and AI within the GLAM sector. But from my perspective, the big blocker was having data sets to train and evaluate models on. So At the time, it was not that difficult to train very useful image classifiers or text classifiers or other kind of specific models for the GLAM sector. But the big blocker to doing that training was having the data to actually train those models, or at least be able to evaluate existing models. So what Big GLAM was doing was a community effort. So we had, dozens of contributors from all over the world. And basically what we were trying to do is to collect existing data sets from the GLAM sector that might be useful for training or evaluating machine learning models. So that took a few different forms. So some data sets were already kind of very focused on machine learning, but quite a lot were kind of existing data sets that perhaps been prepared for slightly different use cases, and then they were kind of adapted to be more amenable to use for machine learning. And I think what I have really enjoyed about that effort, because that was, quite a few years ago that started, but there continues to be engagement with the data sets uploaded in the Big GLAM organization on Hugging Face. And I guess one of the surprising things in a way is like how long impact data sets can have. So I think people are often very focused on models and think models is the kind of key enabler of machine learning. But I think if the GLAM sector really wants to benefit from machine learning, I think actually focusing more on data sets as infrastructure would make a lot of sense. And so I can think of two kind of examples that might be nice to highlight. So one is that there was a data set we uploaded to the Big GLAM organization focused on object detection for kind of historic art images. So when this data set was created, there was quite a lot of interest in object detection, and even in the GLAM sector, people were using object detection models, but often they were using existing models that had been developed for academic competitions or for kind of commercial purposes. So the actual objects these models were detecting were not at all relevant to GLAM. So people would run one of these models across their collection and be like, oh, hey, we've got like 3 bananas in our collection this model's found. And it's like, okay, that's maybe a nice like toy example. It's not actually very useful for anything you might want to do unless you happen to be working on kind of bananas in your collection. But this data set allowed you to kind of train and then find categories and images that were kind of much more relevant for, art history curation and discovery and things like that. So anyway, this data set has been up on the Big GLAM org for quite a few years. And then very recently, someone kind of trained a new model on that data set, and a model that's kind of very computationally efficient and could, run easily on the kind of hardware that the GLAM sector has available. And I think it's, maybe quite a small example. It's not something that all institutions are going to use, but I think having these data sets out there then fosters this kind of potential for people to continue to build on those data sets and train new models. And then I think that potentially could lead to fostering a very kind of healthy ecosystem of kind of tools being shared and developed that are more relevant for GLAM. And just one more example from the kind of Big GLAM effort. One of the very large data sets we worked on was a collection of newspapers from Europeana. So they had this very large data set of historic newspapers from many different collections and in many different languages. But one of the challenges with working with that is that the data set at the time was released in Alto XML and formats that are very familiar to people working in libraries, but not formats that are useful or kind of, I guess, particularly user-friendly for people working in the machine learning sector. So for that data set, we did quite a lot more work to transform it into a slightly different format that made it easier to work with for machine learning purposes. And actually quite a lot later, again, that data set went into some other very large data sets that were used to train open LLMs. So it's probably not a kind of key ingredient in those data sets, but again, it's contributing to this ecosystem where potentially cultural heritage can actually contribute to training language models and also training language models in more languages. So I think this is potentially an area that libraries can engage in a lot more. I think there's some trepidation from some institutions about whether that's a good idea or not, but I think the opportunity is there with a little bit of kind of work and potentially a little bit more collaboration in the sector.
Looking at the challenge, you've actually already hinted at some of the challenges: data sets, their formats, the fact that even when data exists, it's not always in a form that's usable. So, from your perspective, what are the biggest obstacles facing the GLAM sector when it comes to deploying machine learning? What are the key hurdles that need to be overcome to make machine learning truly accessible and sustainable for the GLAM community?
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, there's probably two major challenges. I mean, I think there's a lot of specific ones, but I think one is around funding for the GLAM sector. So I kind of already mentioned that I think there's a lot of opportunities for GLAM institutions to take a much more central role in the development of a kind of AI ecosystem. And I think particularly within Europe, there's an opportunity for that. But I think that can't just be done on top of the existing roles that these institutions have, and it needs to come with a lot more funding. And I think particularly, I think the funding needs to ideally shift from project-based funding, where you say, hey, we fund this kind of research project, you kind of work on it for a year or maybe 2 years, you kind of publish a few papers, and then you kind of wrap up and you're done. Because I think it's very difficult for those kind of projects to have a long-term impact on kind of institutions and develop the infrastructure that's required for this kind of work to be sustainable. Um, and then I guess alongside funding, I think there is also potentially some kind of clarity or opportunity, particularly around issues to do with copyright. So I think there's a lot of discussion around copyright and AI that's very focused on kind of contemporary artists and creatives being compensated for their work, which I think is a very important issue. But I think there's also this slightly parallel question, or potentially a tangential question, depending on how you view it, about the works that libraries have, which are potentially out of copyright or hundreds of years old, but there's still actually quite a lot of legal uncertainty. And I think there's a slightly different question from my perspective about how copyright plays a role in those instances versus how copyright plays a role for works created, in the last couple of decades. And I think, partly because of this, but, probably also for cultural reasons, I think a lot of cultural heritage institutions can be rather conservative about copyright and other related issues. And I think the impact that that can potentially have is that there's a lot of actors who are working with GLAM collections, potentially not that publicly. And the GLAM institutions themselves are not actually feeling able to, publish the full extent of their data that they would like to, and having to kind of work in very constrained environments where, perhaps people have to do stuff in a very suboptimal way to kind of comply with this worry about copyright and other legislation. So I think there's a bit of an opportunity to perhaps have a slightly more nuanced approach to some of these legal questions, and particularly for institutions like libraries and archives and museums, to potentially give them a little bit more protection and empower them to kind of experiment more with their collections without worrying about these kind of legal questions quite as much as they do at the moment.
Thank you, Daniel. That's a very valid point. Let's turn now to the future. Looking ahead over the next few years, what are your ambitions at Hugging Face? Do you see your work expanding around datasets, tool development, GLAM collaborations, or perhaps machine learning education and awareness?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in terms of my ambitions for my role at Hugging Face, I think there's a few areas that I'm keen to expand on. So one area which I've worked on and off with is kind of a little bit more of the flip side of what I've been discussing, but how ideas from library science can contribute to a healthier machine learning ecosystem. So I've already built some tools at Hugging Face. So there's a librarian bot, for example, that makes pull requests to add metadata to people's data sets for things like the language in the data set has, And I'd kind of like to build on some of that work. So I think as AI improves, there's more opportunities for building those kind of automated tools that help with metadata generation for data sets and models. So I'd kind of like to continue to build on some of that kind of work. I think in terms of libraries and the GLAM sector and AI, I think Hugging Face has already become like the home of most machine learning focused research. But I think as more and more domains are starting to use machine learning, I'm keen that they also kind of adopt this open source approach and they build this kind of practice of sharing, and also practices around how to effectively share data sets, models, tools. And I guess that's kind of my big hope and sometimes frustration with the GLAM sector adopting these tools, is that I think there's a lot more scope for collaboration. I think, again, data sets are one area where there's a lot more opportunity that could be explored. So I think at the moment we're in this kind of stage where there's a lot of very powerful models that potentially can do very useful things for GLAM use cases. And I think one big missing piece is to have data sets to evaluate those models properly on the kinds of use cases that libraries have. So I think you kind of see these, open and proprietary large language models published, and they have these scores for various different benchmarks. But a lot of those are either coding focused or focused on domains, which might have some parallels to the work that GLAM does, but they're not kind of exactly the same. So I think even having some shared effort around, okay, let's build some data sets to evaluate, some tasks that libraries care about. So an obvious one is metadata generation, or at least contributing to metadata generation. So a lot of libraries are dealing with more and more born digital collections, and being able to actually describe those at scale is not going to be possible to do purely through kind of human generated metadata. So a lot of libraries want to explore large language models for helping with that task. But I think they're either not doing the evaluation step that much, or they're doing that kind of behind closed doors and then not necessarily sharing what they found. So I think there's probably a lot of wasted effort, but also money, with people all kind of in parallel playing around with these tools and seeing what works. And I think there could be some kind of collaboration on those kinds of questions as a sector. But I think also on a kind of slightly more ambitious footing, I think there's opportunity for libraries to also start training models together, and training models that are maybe a little bit more modest in what they set out to do. So very task specific and maybe domain specific. But I think the tools and kind of approaches for training and fine tuning models are kind of out there. I think, again, what's probably missing for the GLAM sector is curated data sets to train those models on. But I think that would have, some major benefits. I think partly it's a kind of very concrete way of collaborating. So it kind of gets away from this, maybe this is slight cynicism on my part, but I think there's a slight danger in the library sector that collaborations just end up with like, okay, we make a PDF of shared statements and then you do that again in 2 years. And it's very kind of, what could we do in the future? And I think sometimes this is maybe one of the things I've learned from moving from libraries to startups is I think you learn a lot by just doing a project and saying, okay, we set out to do this. And then along the way, you kind of learn a lot of things. So I think let's train a model to do X thing. And then along the way, libraries potentially learn a lot of different things that are involved in that process. So I think that's probably my kind of big hope, that libraries start to kind of push forward in that direction a little bit more. And I think that could have some very concrete benefits. And going back to, the first thing to get started, I think for me, it always comes back to data. So I think there's, a lot of things you can do to start experimenting with, large language models or other approaches and tools that you can begin to explore. But I think the more and more you want to get into this topic, I think it's, again, around data. So I think thinking or learning about how to share a data set openly, I think is a very good starting point for librarians or information professionals wanting to start exploring this topic. Going back to the question of evaluation, I think learning and going through the process of building an evaluation data set, I think is a very valuable skill. And I think you will learn a lot about how AI actually works from doing that. And I think potentially if you kind of go through the whole process and can share that openly, then that's something that can benefit others for a very long time. And I think potentially can have a longer term benefit than, okay, I trained this model, which without the kind of underlying data being publicly available, I think the model will live for maybe a couple of years, but I think the data set could live for, a decade or more if it's put together nicely. So I always focus on data as the kind of first thing to work on.
You've already touched on the role policymakers can play through funding and clearer legal frameworks. But are there other kinds of support or signals that could help encourage more long term, sustainable initiatives rather than short term projects? And finally, what advice would you give the GLAM sector as they begin exploring AI in their institutions?
Okay, so I guess my one message then for policymakers and the GLAM sector and potentially also the public is to think about how the GLAM sector can act as a coordinator or enabler of this collaboration around data sets and models that are kind of driven by more kind of public facing or kind of, I guess, human driven use cases for AI. So I think there's an opportunity for the GLAM sector to kind of enable and coordinate a lot of that collaborative effort, and also for potentially the public to be involved in that. But for that to happen, there needs to be considerable funding to enable GLAM sector to kind of work on that kind of project. So I think that would be my big call to action, would be more collaboration and more funding for the GLAM sector to enable that collaboration.
Thank you, Daniel.